Welcome everybody. Today is Neurodiversity Day, and this is also the moment in the year where one pioneer gets the ability to speak the keynote of the year, the Neurodiversiteitsrede in Dutch language. And this year we have one of the most special speakers we ever had. It is Judy Singer, a sociologist from Australia, who in her work in 1996 was one of the very first ones to coin the word neurodiversity itself. And from one of her works, it got popularized in the "Why Can't You Be Normal for Once in Your Life" chapter. And I'm going to read a couple of sentences of that before we give the words to Judy Singer to speak her mind about this subject. Her words from the chapter were, from me, "The key significance of the autism spectrum lies in its call for and anticipation of a politics of neurological diversity, or neurodiversity. The neurologically different represent a new addition to the familiar political categories of class, gender, race, and will augment the insights of the social model of disability. The rise of neurodiversity takes postmodern fragmentation one step further, just as the postmodern era sees every once too solid belief melt into air. Even our most taken for granted assumptions that we all, more or less, see, feel, touch, hear, smell, and sort information in more or less the same way, unless visibly disabled, are being dissolved." Judy Elder is being considered one of the elders of the movement, and we adore her work, and we are very honored to have her on our Diversity Pride Day for the keynote speech, or the Neurodiversiteitsrede. Judy, thank you for being with us. And without further ado, we'd like to give you the word for the keynote of the year.
Well, thank you very much for that fulsome introduction. And I must say it's very exciting to be in this absolutely magnificent virtual surroundings. So I'm really looking forward to getting into it. So I will begin here. Yes, so it's a great honor to be here and to address you all. And here we go. Okay, well, thank you very much for having me here, and I'm going to launch straight into it. I'm going to talk about neurodiversity. The theme is looking backwards, looking forwards, and I'm going to be talking about the past, how I got the idea, where I got the idea from, so a little bit about my origins and background. Then I'm going to look back at the era of the 1990s and the social currents of that time that explain why this concept emerged at the time that it did. I'm going to talk about a little bit about the present, some of the huge strides and gains that we have already made, and some of the current issues, the conflicts and triumphs of the era. And then I'm going to get out my crystal ball and look at the future. And I'm not a great clairvoyant, so I'm going to put a few scenarios before you, I guess, and let's see how it plays out. I guess I began my work from the point of view of having been in the middle of 3 generations of women somewhere on the autistic spectrum. I didn't realize this till after my daughter was born, and I realized at that point that there was something hereditary in the family. And I was a sole parent. I couldn't work because I didn't have any family support. So I decided I'd go back to university. They paid us $30 a week extra to go to university. And I also was drawn to, I've always been drawn to the social sciences, and particularly sociology. I think I'm a bit of a systems thinker, in the sense that Simon Baron-Cohen talks about it, a systematizer, he tends to talk about it in terms of very male orientation, you know, systems of maths, systems of computing, science, and everything. Well, I liked science too, but I systematized sociologically, and I was always looking for the bigger picture. It took me about 8 years to finally read about Temple Grandin and to contact my local autistic society, and then we knew where we all belonged. And then because being a sole parent, I was without any real family support. My mother also needed support at that stage. She was already quite old. I couldn't work anymore, so I decided to go back to university. And actually, I've been a student at least in three decades. Like, I've been to university in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. Finally made it at the 90s, and I was always drawn to politics and the social sciences. So that's what I studied, and I came across the disability rights movement. I happened to sign up for a course on disability rights, disability studies rather, and it just absolutely blew my mind. But I also realized that it didn't quite fit us, because in those days disability was only described as physical, intellectual, or mental illness, and none of those fitted us, obviously. And so I began to pursue that topic, and at that time I was starting to become interested in the green movement, and I guess I might segue into more about the times in which I came up with this idea, because it was the late 1990s, and we were in a time of great transition. Like, there'd been all the great liberation movements, the gay movement, the feminist movement, initially the Black civil rights movement, and they had all made tremendous gains and changed society on the one hand, and I perceived that we needed a movement like that. And I was part of the autistics. I forgot to say the important part, that while I was at uni, we got computers for the first time, and I discovered my first online autism self-advocacy groups, and I joined several of those, and there was a very exciting time for us, because we started to discover all our commonalities. And okay, so I guess it's a good time to talk about why neurodiversity. And the reason is that at that time, there were massive changes. So I want to go back to the era of the 90s and what was happening at that time. And two things that really caught my attention was that, first of all, the disability rights movement had really developed a lot of theory, and secondly, there was the rise of neuroscience. I'm going to talk about where the word actually came from, and I noticed that neuroscience was the hard science as opposed to the soft science of psychology, which was sort of, at that stage, psychotherapy was becoming a bit of a joke, and it also done a lot of harm to autistic people, because we were constantly encouraged to go back and see what our parents had done to us to make us like that, and it didn't occur to anyone. In my case, it was eye contact. Like, I spent decades of expensive psychotherapy trying to work out why I couldn't make eye contact and whose fault it was. And so, the whole psychotherapeutic couch, Freudian couch, was becoming a bit of a joke, and suddenly we had the hard science of neuroscience, and it was taking over. And it's sort of like neuroscientists were the new high priests of our era. That was the first thing. And then there was the environmental movement was picking up speed, and they were talking about diversity. And at that stage, it had been through basically the Black Civil Rights Movement. It was about ethnic diversity, but now they were talking about biodiversity. And I've got a little story. I'm Jewish, and I'm not religious, but sometimes I go along to cultural events, and I went to one particular thing where the rabbi there challenged us to come up with a new, better set of 10 commandments than God. And so I knew this is rigged. I'm not going to be able to win this one, but I think I can do better than God. And I'd always thought, how come with all the 10 commandments, there's still so much racism and anti-Semitism in the world? And I thought, what if the first commandment had been honor diversity, or else you'll all end up like cactus in the desert? And I presented this. I thought it was great, and the rabbi pretended not to hear. So that made me really angry. Rolled up. So this whole idea of diversity was just really stuck in my mind. And so I put the two together, neurodiversity as a subset of biodiversity. Biodiversity was considered extreme, that the more diverse an environment, biologically, the more sustainable that ecosystem and more flourishing that ecosystem was. And I thought, well, why not apply that to human society as well? The more neurodiverse society is, the more sustainable that society is, and the more adaptable, and the more that culture can flourish. So now I'm not sure how conscious I was of all that, in that I didn't define the word, but I just knew instinctively that it absolutely was right for the times. And I was quite certain that I want to actually say that I've really felt that the autistic self-advocacy movement of that era, with Jim Sinclair, obviously, Temple Grandin, one of the e-groups that I was in, started by Martijn Dekker. Also, do you know him? He's from Netherlands. And we had the most extraordinary conversations, and I was so excited, and I was telling everybody, there's autistic people everywhere, and this is really going to change the world in terms of how we see human beings, and you're going to get so much more understanding out of it if you start to understand your odd autistic relatives. And I remember at that time, you'd pick up something like the New York Times, and every week they'd have an article about some genius, and why was he so eccentric, and what was wrong, all these speculations. And I'm sitting there thinking, they're autistic, that's all. Or it was Asperger's at the time. So I thought this was very exciting, and I had a feeling this movement was going to change the world. And I also realized that it wasn't just us. It was, we were talking about autistics and cousins, and that was ADHD, and that we needed an umbrella term for a movement. That we needed a movement, and we needed an umbrella term, and we needed a movement like the gay or the black rights or the feminist movement. And so I put that in there, and then and then I forgot about it, basically, because what I really did was, that I'm very proud of, was that I actually wrote the first sociological account of this new social movement, and I called my thesis, you see it all, and it says here, Odd People In, I called it, the birth of community amongst people on the autistic spectrum, And then I subtitled it A Personal Exploration of a New Social Movement Based on Neurological Diversity, and which I then shortened to neurodiversity, because I was thinking, well, we can't, neurological diversity movement is a hell of a mouthful. And then I thought, oh, neurodiversity. And so I'm really proud of the fact that I wrote the first thesis to actually look at this phenomenon, and what I was really interested in at the time was, well, lots of things. Because no one had done anything sociological about that, and I had to do it in 15,000 words because I was only an honours student, and I was interested in applying the disability rights movement's ideas at the same time as I was critical of them. And I was also talking about, I was using the social model of disability versus the medical model. Do you think I need to explain that to? Okay, so I was interested in psychology as well as sociology, but I prefer sociology because we saw psychology as being basically about fitting people into society as it is, whereas sociology is about looking at what it is about, analysing society and changing it, making society fit actual humans better. So that was the social model of disability. Well, the medical model of disability simply states that there is a problem within the individual, so we must fix the individual. And the question is, what is it about this? What is wrong with this person and how can we fix it? Whereas the social model simply says, what is it about society and its barriers that stops this person from flourishing? And that was the model that we used. I personally think we need the best of both, and each case is I personally think we need the best of both, and because each case and each human being is different and has different needs. So I was not an uncritical social model fundamentalist, but I'm still based in making the social analysis rather than the psychological analysis. And I notice that many of the people in the neurodiversity movement say they're for the social model, but they're still defining themselves in very medical terms and thinking about themselves in psychological terms and worrying about, the diagnosis. They're still privileging, I suppose, the medical model. And one of the reasons that they do this, I think, is because of our welfare system. That our welfare system is a label-based system. And so if you want the support, I'm not sure if it's the same everywhere in the world, certainly in England, Australia, it is like that. If you want the support, you've got to get yourself that label and you've got to hang on to it for dear life. In terms of the future of neurodiversity, I hope that eventually we will move away from this dependence on, these very atomistic, reductive labels to needs-based supports, so that people can say, well, this is what my needs are, this is what I can offer. So a much more individual-based approach. What happened after I finished my thesis was that I had to go back to work, and that was the end of my academic career. And then I was out of the field for the next 20 years, and then suddenly I started to hear that this neurodiversity movement idea had caught on, and that and that people were talking about it. So I then sort of had to come up to speed, and and I'm just absolutely amazed at the huge, giant strides that we have made in those very few years. I think the autistic self-advocacy movement really has changed Western society's perception of what a human being is. Everybody's talking about it. Everyone's talking, well, generally speaking, it's very widely known. People are starting to get some of the ideas. There's just been such an explosion of creativity within the movement, and all the discourse on social media. The fact that major corporations are now adopting neurodiversity policy. And generally it's so well known to the public. So that's just been absolutely amazing and wonderful. And I've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years networking. So in the last couple of years, last 2 or 3 years, I've really got to know the field, and I've talked to so many people who are in the field, and who I've got really good networks. I'm sometimes very frustrated about being in Australia at the moment when there's so much happening, but a lot of it is already coming to Australia as well. So, and what I've noticed on social media is, and from my networks, so that there's two things. There's confusion about the medical versus the social model and where we're actually up to with that. There's sort of language matters. There's lots of debates about language and what does neurodiversity mean and what's the correct language to use. And I've noticed in one of my speeches, the one that I made at Stanford University, I started noticing what I called the commodification of neurodiversity, turning it into a business, neurodiversity in the workplace. There's so many industries now, sort of growth industries, are burgeoning out of this. I'm very interested in neurodiversity in the workplace. I think it needs a lot of it needs regulation, it needs evaluation to see how well people are actually doing what they say that they're doing. We have in Australia, I've noticed we have a number of multinational companies who come here saying that about autistic employment or neurodiverse employment, but when you look at their brochures, from my point of view as a woman, it's nearly all male IT guys that they're trading in, I guess, selling. Yes, helping them, but I'm not seeing much effort in creating jobs for autistic women. And I should say, I mean, autistics predominate in action in this movement anyway, and I think it's because it's a much more complex diagnosis, in that there's such a rate. You can have 3 of these, 6 of these, and 3 of these, and I'm just beginning to wonder if it's even a unitary condition, which goes back to what I was saying before, that it would be better if we went to a needs base rather than this kind of very simplifying label. with the language matters, I'm a bit of a linguistic nerd, and I understand very much that language is always evolving and that meanings change. But what does concern me is when neurodiversity is used as a, a, a what's that word? As a short word for neurological disorder or neurologically disordered, because that destroys the whole idea that we are a neurodiverse planet and that everybody is different in it. And I think you can have a neurodiverse workplace, but you can't have a neurodiverse individual. And then we go into neurodivergent. I prefer the idea of neurominority because that builds on the diversity minority model that the Black community originally began. And I like it because it's a political term as well. You know, minorities who've been shut out, who are beginning to advocate for themselves. I also, there's conflict about, you know, when the DSM, so, you know, the Asperger's being enrolled into autism was very controversial, and a lot of people in the community, Asperger didn't want it, but they did it. And I think it's unwittingly caused a lot of conflict between people who, for whom it's an identity as well as disability, to people who have, I know, well, you're not even allowed to use the word severe or moderate, and I understand the mild, moderate, severe, level 1, level 2, level 3, still the same thing, I think. But I think, unfortunately, that's created a lot of conflict, and you see it on Twitter a lot. You know, there's a lot of hate going backwards and forwards, and I think that's just, again, a result of the DSM-5, the medical model, creating these labels and then messing around with them, when I've always believed that naming rights are really important, and that in a way, it's what I said in my thesis anyway, that we need to take a more of an ethnicity-based model or a linguistic minority rather than, or neurological minority model rather than a disability model, which is, but again, I think difference and disability shade into each other, but of course it depends on what you mean by disability as well, you know, so there's sort of layers of meaning that people are getting lost in. But again, I think there's a dialectical process there where you know, this idea came along and then it's criticized, along comes an antithesis, there's conflict, and then a new direction will emerge. So I guess that's where we're looking towards the future. We need to build the future that we want. Yeah, I mean, well, I think I said looking into my crystal ball when I don't have clairvoyance, but I can see, you know, both a positive and a negative future. The positive is that I think we are already changing society. You know, it's interesting that neurodiversity is sold to businesses and corporations as it's going to make your business more efficient and win-win, but that was never my intention with this idea. It was not to make capitalism more efficient, it was to make capitalism more humane. And I think that's already happening, because companies are recognizing that not only these labeled people have quirks and needs, but so does everyone else. And when it's everyone, when we start talking more openly about who we are and showing ourselves, then so can others, and society is already starting to benefit. So our movement is actually changing things without it being, we didn't have to take to the streets and make a revolution, but just by talking and talking and all the discourse and everything that happens and everyone talking about it, society is changing. So that's, you know, I think that's really wonderful. What can I say? There is a lot of rainbows and sunshine in the movement, but I think we need to, in terms of the future, and that saying, we need to expect the best but prepare for the worst. And so, I mean, if we look at some of the things that are happening in society at the moment, we've got obviously pandemic, global warming, shrinking economies. We've got growth of populism. There's backlashes against identity politics. And so in that situation, we've got to think, particularly because so much emphasis is now put on neurodiversity in the workplace, we need to recognize that not everyone is going to get a job, and what are we going to do with the people who don't? And so for me, the important thing is for people to keep talking about the experience and making the changes in and accommodations in the workplace, in the education system. But we also need to have a safety net, and I'm a great believer in universal basic income, where everybody, which gives people enough, everybody without question being given enough money so that they can experiment with their lives and experiment with their creative lives and start, instead of spending time searching futilely for jobs. Our system is very punitive, and you have to look for 20 jobs a week or so. It's really, when there's no jobs, it's just cruel and inhuman. And we need a universal basic wage, no questions asked, and let people find their own level in their own community. And I think the negatives of this crisis is that when times of scarcity, the dominant majority, and also unfortunately the people who are not part of the dominant majority but identify with it, tend to turn against minorities. And so that is why it's very important for neuro minorities to kind of stick together and support each other, which I think we are doing. And just as another advantage of it, I think, is that it goes beyond the nationalisms that divide us, because it's a global thing, and we're minorities around the world. We don't, and so we're cutting across some of the ethnic and nationalism type nonsense that's happening, and all the wars that are happening. I'm thinking that with the they say there's a crisis, opportunity, danger, and I think one of the things that, if things go well, is that we'll become more decentralized again. If we have a universal wage, people can start rebuilding their communities and finding roles for everybody in smaller communities. There's a very well-known economist called Jeremy Rifkin, who talks a lot about how the energy economy, if we move to solar and sustainable energies, is going to require local management. So those are the sorts of things that I'm feeling optimistic about. So definitely looking forward to a world in which everybody can ask for their needs. I always go back to this dictum from a French politician of the 19th century, Louis Brun, who who said that in an ideal society, we give to each person according to their needs and require from each person what they're able to give. And I think that is the perfect ideal to reach for. We may never, ever reach it, but we must continue to strive to meet that. And I think our movement is really doing just exactly that. I think we need to continue to work together. We've just made such enormous progress, and we all have to keep striving towards that ideal. And I like that old, another old saying, which I've from, I think it's from the Talmud. It's not your responsibility to finish the work of perfecting the world, but you're not free to desist from it either. Okay. So I'm not going to give you an inspirational message of guidance or tell you it's all going to be rosy. I've got absolutely no idea. All I can tell you is that we've made a great start. Keep at it. Keep being yourself. Keep trying to do the right thing, the good thing. Don't let yourselves be divided. All the minorities need to stick together and face whatever challenges come up. It's not necessarily going to be easy, but there's going to be fabulous conversations, fabulous insights, fabulous encounters along the way. Good night and good luck.
Thank you, Judy Singer, for the keynote address of the Neurodiversity Pride Day 2021. And everybody, you heard it. Neurominorities need to stick together, and there is still a lot of work to be done for a better future that we're creating, but we are moving forward. If you would like to, you can clap. Judy will not hear it, but it will be appreciated in the virtual space. And for now, we'd like to say thank you.
Okay, bye.
And cut.
Hold on.